Hello, and welcome to the All Myths Are True Scion panel. My name is Neall Raemonn Price. I am the current lead developer of Scion, but not for much longer. Hiromi Cota is going to be taking over for me. They and I are working on God together and developing the God together as the sort of last in the base Scion trilogy of games. Well, quadrology now, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So, Hiromi, do you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit?
Sure. Hi, I'm Hiromi. They, them. I've been working on Scion for a bit and slowly absorbing more and more of the world into my soul until that's all there is. And then I become a dragon and I just wreck everything, which is great. But because as a dragon, I do it secretly because that's how dragons do in the world.
Okay. Next, we have Spider B. Perry. Spider, would you like to say a couple words about yourself?
Sure. Spider Perry. My pronouns are he, they. I have written on many Onyx Path properties, and Trans, Emir, and Cernunnos are either my achievements or my fault, depending on who you ask.
I called them achievements.
I know. You better.
Geoffrey McVey, you are next.
Oh, I'm Geoffrey McVey. I've been working on really just Scion, all of the core books so far, and half a dozen things beyond that. At the moment, I'm most proud of the work on Saints and Monsters and Once and Future, both of which I think are going to add a lot to the game.
Geoffrey's being modest. He is a huge wealth of information and, like everyone on the panel, a great writer. And last but certainly not least, we have David Castro. David?
Hi, I'm David Castro, he, him. I've done a lot of OnyxPath books, mostly Scion, though. You can find my stuff in the Tanomaki, Dragon, and eventually in Saints and Monsters, Once and Future, and God. And yeah, I love these books, and I hope to get to do more of them.
Probably
Okay.
will. Just putting a psychic prediction out there.
Right? I wonder if that's going to happen.
I can mess it up at any moment.
Well, if you do, then we'll have a talk.
All right.
And then
Yeah.
it'll be better.
Then it'll be
So,
better.
yeah. So, all myths are true. That's a line that's in the Scion core book. It's a line that's in Origin. It's a line that's in Hero. It gets repeated in Demigod and God. But what does it actually mean? And what does it mean to both the readers and the writers of it? So why don't we just, very free form, if someone wants to jump in and talk about what it means to them, talk about their experiences wrestling with it. What did you think the first time you read it?
I can go. For me, it plays in that space, that sort of, and this is the big comparison I get a lot, in that like Percy Jackson American God space of, yeah, all myths are true. What you believe happened and what we believe happened, even if they're contradictory. And you can have that sort of like hierarchy of myth that the world was formed as an egg in the cosmic void and also built by another god over here at the same time. And it's just lets you do interesting combinations of things where you don't have to be completely bound by any one faith, and I think that's the most interesting thing about Scion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm still trying to think out how to say what I want to say.
That's okay. I'll talk a little bit about. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Geoffrey.
Oh, okay. No, I just wanted to add to that. There's always, going along with the idea that all myths are true, there's always been a process of, picking out which sections of myth we wanted to put into the games themselves. For example, the Egyptian pantheon. We're talking about several thousand years of changes in the myths, gods rising and falling. So you get, Horus, Ra, Osiris, Aten, god of jazz hands, apparently. It does fit with his art. And, and even as writers, we've decided, okay, we're going to focus on these elements. We're going to leave out these ones. Some of the more problematic parts, as I think we're probably going to talk about later, different writers have decided, whether they want to put them forward, whether they want to leave them aside. I think in every case, we give advice to people at the table. Right? If you don't want to include this element, don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want a more modern reading of something, go ahead and do that. So I think we allow for both a lot of sort of flexibility and creativity at the game table in terms of what you consider canonical and not. And also, I think we address in a very respectful way the fact that if you look closely enough at any mythology, they get really incoherent really quickly. And that's delightful. I mean, that is the thing that excites me most about mythology, is that it is such a beautiful, beautiful mess of human experiences.
So I think kind of piggybacking off of that and maybe looking off to one side, there's a certain number of essential myths, right, that we have told ourselves as people over and over again, from creation myths to the social roles in our communities exist, whatever those social roles may be, how those came to pass, how the rules that we follow in our lives came to occur, like what's the mythology behind them. And I think that we are mistaken as modern people if we think that we don't have some sort of essential myths that we believe as people, and it varies based on the social group that you're in, right? I may get myself in trouble by saying this, but it wouldn't be the first time. The myth of the nuclear family, for example, that there's only ever been, that this is the way that people were meant to be. And that's what, myths tell us, right? How were people meant to be and why were they meant to be that way? And so if you look at the many, many ways that people have lived throughout the history of humanity, you have so many different myths that people have told themselves about why people are the way they are and why the way that I am is the only way that I could ever have been, right? So the myths are not just outside of us. They're not just stories that we tell for fun. They're stories that we tell in order to figure out why we are the way we are, and why is this version of me the version that I came to be, right? So myths are big, but they're also very small. And I think that's really important when you come to a table, because you're creating this mythology for yourself. And no matter what someone wrote about Persephone, no matter what somebody wrote, about Odin or anything like that, right? You're always going to be bringing into being an Odin, a Persephone that has never existed before, because it is the version of that god that tells you as a creator how to create what you want to create, whether you're creating a character, whether you're creating, as a story guide, you're creating a world, you're making something entirely new, and you're doing it because you're selecting the myth that tells the story you want to tell and you're selecting the version of it, and you're like altering that so that it's telling you what you need to hear or what you need to figure out. The number of people who have figured out they're trans, the number of people who figured out, something about themselves through role-playing games is pretty significant, and that comes from that idea that you're telling yourself a myth that you need to hear.
Yeah, one of the things that Geoffrey actually told me very early on in Scion's development cycle was myths express, they don't explain. And I was like, well, Geoffrey, what do you mean by that? And Geoffrey, do you want to spin a little bit more on that before we move to the next part of the topic?
Oh, sure. I have absolutely no idea where I picked that line up. It was.
Do you want me to tell you my recollection of what you said?
Oh, please do. Please do.
Okay. So I asked you what you meant by that, and you said, well, the sort of pop culture thing we learned in elementary school is that, people told myths to explain why there's thunder in the sky, or why rain falls, or why crops grow. And, that's not really true. I mean, ancient folks knew how the world worked in a certain way, even if they didn't know the specifics or the mechanics of it. But instead, myths were mostly built to express their viewpoint of the world. And exactly what Spider was saying, myths were built to express how culture saw itself because of the stories that it continually told, and reinforce that through a shared mythology and a shared experience.
Well,
So,
if I can just build off of that for a moment.
yeah.
One of the, let me put this. So late 19th, early 20th century, anthropologists studying other cultures, James Fraser, Golden Bough, Andrew Lang, doing his stuff. They had this idea that the myths that cultures told themselves were more or less their substitute for science. It didn't take very long for people to sort of stop, look at actual accounts, say, wait a minute, these people over here will do rituals to make it rain. They only do those rituals at the beginning of the rainy season. They're not going to do it in the middle of the dry season. They know full well it doesn't work. They will do rituals to summon herds when it's getting to the time when you need to stock up on food for winter. Now, in the second case there, the thing that I really enjoy about it is that they are expressing a kind of cultural fear through the ritual, through the stories that they tell. They're saying, we're screwed if we don't get enough food for winter. So we're going to express that anxiety and that emotion through stories, and especially through ritual. I have other examples, but I'll hold myself back.
There are examples I know of through my own research of things that we know now that they maybe didn't know how this mountain range protects them from storms, and so, but they know that storms hit other parts of this land. They don't hit as hard here and the only difference is there are mountains here. So we express thankfulness that we are here because the god of the mountain does this thing. But also, and I think this is also important, it's also expressing themselves in differentiating themselves from others. Their myths, their gods are different from the people's over there's gods. Or maybe not even that much. We had talked about how myths get super confusing super fast. We talk about Greek myth as if it's standardized, as opposed to every city-state has a different. The idea of a Greece is historically incorrect. There, for most of history, there was not a standardized Greece. It was hundreds of city-states and small towns, and everybody has their own mystery cult of all of these gods, and they're different from town to town.
Right.
And like, it's very important to keep in mind, as much of these myths are explaining who we are, they're also explaining who we aren't and who we are different from. And I think we sort of lose track of that sometimes.
The cultural
off of that,
prohibit. Oh, go ahead.
Thanks. Tailing off of that, the tagline, all myths are true, pulls from the idea that there's not a standardized people. There's like, even if we're talking about like a specific culture, it's much broader than that, because myths don't exist on paper. Myths exist in people. So there are loads of tellings of myths. There are all sorts of versions of these stories that are told within the culture, and unless you're in that room, you don't have access to it. So Scion kind of taps into that space there, where we have all of this possibility, all of these peoples and their stories and their gods, and we can engage with this variety of myths, with this decentralized authority of the gods, in so far as anything is an authority of the gods.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember when we talk about myths and humanity and kind of the cycle of our history, that for most of human history, the average social group was 200 people or less. So like your average village that people would be born in, live in, die in, people didn't travel much until maybe 100 years ago. Like there were small, like there are migrations over time, right, where you have groups of people moving. There are exceptions. We have people who traveled to as merchants and things like that. But the vast majority of people who didn't get written about, right, because the people who travel are usually the ones who get written about, they lived in communities that they stayed in for most or all of their lives that were probably 200 to 400 people at most. Most people didn't live in Rome. Most people didn't live in any kind of metropolitan situation. So they're living in a small group of people who are geographically probably relatively isolated, and they're telling themselves the stories that they need to exist about why they are who they are. And so this, to just reinforce with numbers, that idea that there isn't one Rome, there isn't one, Greece, there isn't one Norse mythology. There's just not, and there can't be, because you think about how when you talk with your friends, you have so many little things that when people talk to each other, like your in jokes and your variants on language that you have with your spouse or your best friend, that convey a very specific meaning to like maybe 2 or 3 people, right? And myths are exactly the same way in that context, right? If you're using the in joke between yourself and your partners that expresses a very specific meaning, your myth is exactly the same way.
So everyone here has touched on this sort of next topic a little bit in what they've said. So I'd like to sort of throw it out to the group. Scion is fundamentally a role-playing game. It's not a textbook on mythology, although we do our research and we do look at what might be the best variant for a game. But how do all of you go through and look at what is look at what is the best way to translate that into a game, and what do you feel like your priorities are?
Ooh, yes, hello. I'm waiting for this. So I think the first thing that we need to kind of point out, just to set a structure for this, we were talking about this before the panel started, or I was anyway. A lot of the mythology that we talk about, the canon for that mythology, I hate the word canon when it comes to mythology, but we'll use it for framing, ended 2 to 3 to 4 to 5,000 years ago, right? Whatever the myth is, a lot of times, like this big chunk here from like, 10 AD on is probably, not filled with much of anything at all. And so as Scion writers, we first have to look at that and go, okay, well, we can't just leave this huge gap that nothing has happened for 2,000 years for a couple of reasons. One, it is very silly. Like you don't want to buy a book and just have it be a mythology textbook. You want to know what these gods have been doing in the world, right? And you want to know maybe how they related to events that have happened in that time period. And now I've totally lost my train of thought. Oh, nope, it's gone. Somebody else go and I'll come back to it.
So I feel like it is more interesting to know that the I'm probably mispronouncing it, fine. God of War, Goddess of War, I forget which, now runs a Mexican security company. That's dope. I enjoy, especially just the art of here's the gods in their original format, and then here's them in suits and ties in a boardroom. I love that thing is the most interesting to me. And the conceit that makes Scion different from other games that are playing in this space, other fiction that is playing in this space, is the fact that we focus on, okay, cool, and what has Zeus been doing from 4,000 years ago to now? Probably some messed up shit, but whatever. We drill down into that so that we can write fresh stories and not have every game being the trials of Hercules, but in a again. Like I enjoy that. I think the game is better for the fact that we aren't so diehard to canon, despite the hours and hours and books that I've personally read to make sure I'm not offending anyone, and that I'm holding the core theme of what any given pantheon or myth is. That we can twist it so that we can write fiction and write entertaining fiction is sort of the strength that I love Scion for. I'm always saying that this is a game, not a textbook, and I think that is pretty important.
I remembered. So the three things we're basically doing with Scion, at least what I'm doing when I'm writing Pantheons especially, is the previous, like where you're filling in that space. And then you're trying to take those initial myths that we come to from whatever our research is, and we look at the modern myths that we tell ourselves, and we say, well, how can we marry those two myths together? Like the modern myths of capitalism and communism and, the social groups that we have now, all of those groups have their own in-group and out-group mythos, right? So we have to kind of like marry those together. And, what does this god think of, anarchists or whatever? And then third, we have to do something which I am really proud of the way that we've done it, but I think a lot of people kind of skip over in their perception of what our process is. And that's, we have to synthesize a united world or a semi-united world, right, out of the Shen and the, like, look at all these different pantheons. What do they think of each other, right? And how do they relate to each other? Where's their overlap? What happens on the moon? Like, is the moon a place? And how do all the different moon deities get along? How does that happen? So that's the thing that we kind of have to do when we're thinking about all myths are true. Well, if they're all true, then what happens when you put them all in a room together? And that's an essential question that Scion tries to grapple with. I won't say tries to answer, but tries to grapple with, and that we as writers try to grapple with as well. That's where I was going with that.
as a fun consequence of how we work within Scion as writers and creators, is that with all myths being true, people who come from these cultures who have they grew up with these gods, like either on like their front door, their entry, where like around their neck, wherever they grew up with these gods. And if we just presented the myths as the static canon that is found in books, they don't care. They grew up with the gods. They like it's a disservice to them because they already know all those stories. They know the stories better than we do, and are able to put them onto the page. Well, sometimes,
Right.
sometimes the writers and the people of the faith start the same people, but the issue there is that, like, if we can be respectful to the canon, but like we also need to be respectful to the gods and be like, okay, so like this is what the god was like. This is like all of their personality traits. This is how they interact with the world. And so now, hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, where are they now? How are they situated? And like that space is a pretty new and fresh and open space. And so long as we are respectful to the feel of each of the myths, or at least the feel of the general trajectory of the myths, because sometimes legends disagree heavily. See also King Arthur.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But like, we respecting the gods and respecting the canon are two different things, and we do both in Scion. But if we have to choose, probably going to head towards the gods, because we want to make sure that we get them right, because there's no Scion without the gods.
Kraz Alter just said, so it's pretty much up to the story guide to keep things respectful to the cultures we base our pantheons on. And I think that is not only, the answer to that is, of course, yes, like you set the tone for your table. But also, again, even in the modern world, right, even with as connected as we are, our essential groups are still, like, your brain can't handle more than a certain number of people, right? You can't be close to a certain number of people. So your core group is going to be a certain number of people. And so what you have to decide is what's respectful in context of your group. And that, again, comes down to kind of like, what are the stories that you're wanting to tell? What are the myths that you are, drawing out of yourself in order to create this? So the answer is yes, but that's going to vary depending on who you are, what the rules of your in-group are. I mean, like, so I'm Jewish, as I tell everyone all the time, but like, y'all love me, but there's a third.
What?
I know, it's a shock.
I didn't know, it's weird.
I know, but we have a term. It's a minhag, which is tradition, right? Tradition, and that is really to express that, like, it's, yes, we have, certain universal, generally, truths, but like a lot of the way that you do things is down to that group. So what's the minhag of your table? What's the, what does respectful look like is going to vary. Obviously, there are certain universal truths that we try to foster in terms of what respect looks like in Scion. But the fine details of that are going to be down to your group. And that is not only up to the story guide to set the tone, but for the players to, bring back to the story guide and say, well, we'd rather do it this way. Or if someone at the table is maybe not keeping to the values that you decided as a group, then that's not just on the story guide. That is a whole table culture kind of thing.
And I frankly don't see the difference where being respectful to the faith of whatever pantheon you have is to like any of the rules people I have definitely gotten in fights with before, who are like diehards to a certain canon in a different game of this is what the lore is, and this is what makes no sense, and this is what makes sense, and this is what we agree the lore is. For like there is no difference other than Scion is based on the things that real people believed or believed in, and say Shadowrun is tech elves, whatever. Like you can, these are not separate things. These are the exact same things. It's just, that added bonus of some people really believe that. And I would say that if you're struggling to hold that in your mind, the is this respectful to the pantheon or deity I'm working with, you can probably find through the multitudes of books we have and pantheons that we cover somebody else that fits what you're trying to do. It doesn't have to be Zeus. It could be someone else. And that probably would fit better rather than trying to fit the like Greek gods into every story. You could probably find something else, and it might take a little more time to like maybe pick up some like extra research if you wanted to do that. But like it's there for you, and I would suggest doing that.
Yeah.
If I could add to that, it's worth pointing out that I think we, certainly for all of the pantheons, we try to give people the tools to do as much of that as possible. So every write-up for a god is, here's a basic summary. Here are the kinds of scions that they pick. And that paragraph is really useful for saying, what kind of people does a modern version of this god want to hang out with? And then the last one is, how do they incarnate in the world? And that as well gives you that modern update. It gives you that idea of, okay, Zeus might appear like this because he really does still like to be in power. Dionysus, I was having fun somewhere until someone disrespects his mother and gets their head torn off. But all of this stuff is there in the material, condensed. I know David is working on the redacted pantheon for God right now. And I worked on one that is incredibly obvious to guess for once in future. These things take an absurd amount of research to condense down into that version that is both respectful and playable and fun, most importantly, something that gives you the idea of these gods in a really condensed form. So you can work just off of that.
Off screen, I have 5 books right now. They're sitting right here, right now. 5 books.
I know that I have literally read everything on the pantheon that I wrote.
Yeah, I think too, when we do our research, one of the things, at least one of the things I'm running into for the pantheon that I'm working on right now, is that it has so little that isn't, oh gosh, I'm trying to find the right way to put this, that isn't looked at through a very specific lens of another culture and another religion. Because the thing that I'm writing is, and I know this is something that David's struggling with right now as well. And a lot of times, the pantheon that I'm currently working on is portrayed by the Abrahamic Christianity specifically as being like demons, right? But in that religion, maybe that's the case, right? In that faith, in that perspective, maybe that's the case. But trying to find things that don't have that slant to them can be a real challenge. And so a lot of times we can try to find what we can find, and then we have to kind of back it out and say, well, devoid of that, like if we try to remove that, what does it look like? And it's like trying to take the filter off of a photograph. If someone's filtered something, and washed it out the way my camera is washing me out right now, well, where are the details in that? And we have to kind of paint them back in, and we aren't always going to get it correct, but we will always, as Hiromi said, try to be true to the gods and try to be true to the idea of what they represented to their cultures or what they represent to their cultures now. We do have a lot of living faiths that are represented in Scion. So, to try to just kind of be as true as we can to the ideas of what they represented and what they can represent in the present, which is to me as important. I keep saying that canon is like a corset. It should support you and not constrict you. And if it constricts you, you should take it off. So.
Yeah. In the same way that, we spend a lot of time trying to, at least in my case, decolonize the text I have. Trying to, for lack of a better term, save the information we have from the people who wrote it. Because almost always, especially the academic texts that we have about these things, are very rarely written by the people who believe them. These stories are almost never told by or at least recorded by the people who tell these stories. And you try and whittle back, all right, cool, what is the shading given by let's be honest, the white guy who wrote this shit down? Can I curse? I don't know.
Can.
Who wrote these things down, and what maybe they believed, and you take a bunch of different sources, all written by different people, to try and get to the things that rhyme, that can hint to the truth not written down. At the same time, we also try to avoid. We try and tell these myths as they were never stopped being believed in. They are continuous faith and not neo faith. I don't know how to say that in a more broad way, but
the beliefs like
reclaimed faith. Yeah. And so like I am less interested in a story about, well, not interested, but like I want to tell the story of these people who believed in redacted have always believed in them, unless that they reclaimed the faith, in this case something like 600 years 400 years later, rather than like I want them to be continuous and what would make sense as evolution, because religions change. We see this in the living faiths that we still have. These things change, context changes, and if we don't include that in our canon, we are doing a disservice to these gods.
And the fun thing is that like the better job that we do as writers in painting the world and showing you how the gods interact with it and being respectful to those gods is that if we didn't name or outline one of the other myths and you as players are familiar with it, you can just drop that right in. Like, as long as we've done our job and we try really fucking hard to do our jobs, then the world and the myths that you know just fit together like fucking Voltron and make your story better, more powerful with a giant sword that you can slash through. I lost my metaphor. I was going for something cool and Voltron-y, but nah.
We put together the skeleton and the tendons, and we handed over for the players and story guides, trying to put the meat and the skin on it for their chronicles. What we're doing is just giving you a framework, I think, in most cases. We're trying to just build that very basic, loose, here's the shape of what could be. Now you can, put on that what you'd like, because a skeleton, there's infinite variations of the person you can build on a given skeleton. So.
And we give you a system in which, all right, cool. You really wanted to see XYZ god in this pantheon, or you wish that we had covered XYZ pantheon and we didn't. There's Storyteller Vault. You can take any of our books and go, cool, this is the template for what a pantheon looks like.
Mm-hmm.
If you want it and we don't give it to you, make it. Get out, put it out there, let people see it. Maybe make some bucks on your own if you want to do that. I have a bad habit of commercializing all of the things I do for fun. So if you don't want to sell your pantheon, don't. But
but you can.
If you can, and if it just lives in your game, cool. If you sell it, that's fine. But we give you the template, we show you how to do it. If we don't make the thing you want to see, you can take the energy, let's say, not anger, but the energy that you have about it, and make those things, because we give you the tools.
Absolutely. So, I'm sorry.
Well, one thing I wanted to really just briefly touch on when we're talking about pantheons and what you're building and things like that, I do want to, I think Demigod is out to backers right now, but there is a really, really fabulous section in Demigod that talks about disability. And I know that in Saints and Monsters, I wrote some more stuff about, whenever that comes out, there's some stuff about how to handle other marginalized cultures as well. Because a lot of the myths that we see are not particularly kind to disability, are not particularly kind to people in the outgroup, to queer people, to some are, some aren't. But the section in Demigod, especially, the writer there did a really fantastic job of talking about how those marginalized identities are sometimes touched on in myths, and how to handle that in a way that is not hurtful to your players at the table. And I really want to just kind of briefly say that no myth canon is ever an excuse to hurt one of your players. And should never be a reason to hurt one of your players. So if part of a myth that you're planning on touching on is something that is going to negatively portray a marginalized identity that is especially of a player at your table, please change that. And nothing that we write is ever meant to give story guides or fellow players a reason to be hurtful, right? Canon is not a reason to hurt people. Please change it.
Always prioritize the people in front of you and at your table than people who may have believed something thousands of years ago.
Yep. And I just wanted to point to that really excellent resource, because I really think that Elsa did such a great job with it.
Yeah, she did. So we are about 15 minutes away from time, so I'm just going to move on to a couple of the questions that have been percolating in the chat. I'll answer one, and then I will toss the rest to my fellow panelists. So have you all thought about different time period source books, the past or the future? Yes. I have often thought about alternate world Scion that is, for example, post-apocalyptic. That would be a very cool way to sort of do that, and also raid some mechanics from our Dystopia Rising story path game, just yank them out of there and repurpose them. We've also thought about the past a lot, but as so many of my other panelists have noted, because of Scion's unique cosmology, the past changes, and sometimes mythic events occur and then get brought into memory. So that's an interesting thing, but we definitely want to get through a lot of like the really meaty modern day stuff before we move on to alternate or past. The present is always something that people can relate to, and they can definitely seize upon a little bit more. Someone once asked me, why didn't you take all the colonialism out of Scion? And I said, well, not for nothing, but a lot of marginalized cultures worked the way that they were oppressed, or worked that marginalization into their mythology as a way of expressing themselves because of this trauma forced upon them. And so for us to kind of ignore that is to ignore them telling their actual story and their actual myths. And so, that's something we definitely want to focus on, rather than shortchanging it or changing things. To move on, how would you say Scion God makes a player feel like a god? I think everyone here is writing on God, so have at it. How do you make players feel godly? And this is a con, so spoil away. Go bananas.
A word? All right.
Yeah,
That file,
do it.
that file's still blank. Sorry, Hiromi. I haven't gotten to my story. It's Pride Month. What do you want? That file, honestly, my story guiding file is only half done, so I don't feel ready to answer that one for myself.
Spoiler level has been elevated to 2.
So you just said I can spoil, but then again, I'm like, but can I though? Can I say things? I don't know.
You have both lead content developers here.
That don't mean nothing. So I'm working on the semi pantheon for the people. These are the native people of the Antilles. So like Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, some southern Florida as well. Basically, the people who Columbus first met, which is why I have to decolonize everything that we've got, because the only things that we have are the stuff that Columbus's people wrote down. And for me, how you make someone feel like a god is give them fabulous, magnificent, mythic powers and the same level of consequences. Whenever a god does something, it reverberates through the world. This is where like fate binding, I think, comes to shine, where like Thor is, for some, this like redheaded dude who went into drag to go get his hammer back. In one place, and in another place, he looks a lot like Chris Hemsworth in a bad way. So like for players, you have to give them situations and where they can do godlike things, but also be like, all right, cool. So now they saw you at this park doing this thing. And now you have a cult that has you be the patron of this super mundane thing. And now, because you're building up your legend, because you're a new god, now you have to go do that thing some more, even if you don't like it, because they believe you to do it and you're fate bound to do it now.
All right, cool. Now I get to spoil. I know. But the pantheon that I'm working on, now that I can say it, is the Canaanite and Phoenician pantheon, which means that in terms of how to bring in that question, right? I am having to talk a lot about meta god stuff, like how do gods move around? How do their identities change over time? Because the central god, or at least the starting central god of that particular pantheon is El, and by El we mean Elohim, right? According to a lot of the research, that the split between the Phoenicians and the Israelites, one version of the god went this way and one version of the god went that way. And in our world, where the Phoenicians never stopped, right, the question is like, well, what happened there, right? And so very delicately and very nervously, and oh God, what am I doing? Kind of trying to answer the question of what do gods do, and how do they move and react over time, and why does that happen? And that's really like a lot of what is going to have to go into the stuff that I'm writing. And hopefully players will be able, and story guides will be able to take those ideas of how the kind of tectonic movements of pantheons occur as people change, and take those things and be able to turn them into a meaningful story and a meaningful chronicle for themselves.
Yeah, like 4 minutes, so I'm going to speed spoiler real fast. The ways that Scion God makes players feel like a god is because Scion God is kind of 3 games in one. You have stuff operating in the overworlds. We have stuff operating within how you're running your incarnations, and then we also have your cults and your religions. So like we have 3 different levels of interacting with faiths and pantheons and gods available for you at your table. And so like whichever facet of a god speaks to you, you can play that, because like the whole power range is opened up for God.
Yep. I do want to also slightly like slide another book recommendation in there. If you are really hyped for God, Realms of Magic and Mystery, that obviously we don't know when that's coming out. I wrote on that, and I think Jeff, did you write on that as well? Yeah, and there is a lot of stuff about the overworlds in there. I got to write a lot of like Norse and the Tuatha, overworlds, and there's a ton of selections of the overworlds and the midworlds and all kinds of fun things that you may want to have on hand if that's really something that you want to focus on in your game, just as an additional resource. Obviously, you don't need it, but there's a ton of great work that I saw from the other writers in there, and hopefully myself as well.
So I'm sorry, go ahead, Geoffrey, and then we'll wrap up with everyone's handles and where they can find us online.
No, I'm perfectly happy to do this very quickly. The stuff that I'm contributing to this is basically how collections of gods, if they want to, can decide to build their own pantheon, building up, step by step as they become more powerful, until they reach that point where they have always existed. And I like to do these things in stages, so it'll probably look a lot like that. And what's the other thing I'm doing? Oh, overworlds, yeah. But I'm going to decide that our time must be up, so I don't spoil anything at all.
Anonymously, Thracian, the answer to that is no. They seem to be one of the few pantheons that we've worked with in Scion that has no reconstructed religion whatsoever. And so I'm pretty much making it up as I go along, and hopefully I'll do a good job with it. There are no Canaanite folks around that I can find. So there's an awful lot of Christian gods, folks saying that they're demons. But there's not a lot of modern worshipers, or any that I can find.
Yeah, that was definitely a problem with a lot of the pantheons on the core, especially ones that are reconstructionists. But Scion assumes that everything's in an unbroken line. So there's a little layer of fictionality over that. So, okay, we are going to wrap it up. Thank you everyone for watching the stream. Thank you to my fellow panelists for participating in this. I think we all pitched this same panel separately. But yeah, if you want, we want to find you online. We'll start with Hiromi. If we want to find you online, where will we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Hiromi Cota. HiromiCota.com is also a good way to find me. And I write queer fiction. I'll link to that in a sec. But yeah, if you want to hit me up on Twitter, I'm right there. So.
Okay, Spider, where would we find you online?
So I am on every social media platform except for Instagram as VA Spider, and if somehow someone got VA Spider on Instagram ahead of me. I don't know how that happened. Also on Patreon under VA Spider, and you can also find me at nerdykeppie.com, NERDYKEPPIE. Also coming soon to an Exalted Essence Kickstarter near you.
Okay, Geoffrey, where will we find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at AM_Geoffrey. But easiest way is probably go to the Onyx Path Discord, where I am creatively named Geoffrey.
And David, where will we find you online, or links to some of your work?
You can find me on Twitter at The Inked Knight, davidcastro.net. My Patreon is Inkstain Studios. And you can find me not on this channel, but on Dork something. God, it's gone out of my mind now. But I will be playing Exalted Essence tomorrow at 2, I believe, with somebody else in this panel, being a totally normal person.
So normal. So normal.
Certainly.
Not a shapeshifter at all.
And lastly, you can find me at Burnt Neall, Neall, on Twitter, and you can find me hanging around the various Onyx Path Discords, spreading spoilers that my fellow developers would rather me not spoil. But yeah, too bad. All right, thank you to everyone for watching. Thanks to everyone here for speaking, and happy mything.
Get vaccinated.
Yes.